Have you ever imagined facing a warrior almost 3 meters tall, fully covered in armor? What if I told you that the Bible recounts the story of two giants so terrifying that they made entire armies tremble? Get ready for an epic journey through the sacred pages, where we will see how God used the unlikely to defeat the seemingly invincible. Our journey begins in the desert, where the Israelites, newly freed from slavery in Egypt, faced their first giant, Og, the king of Bashan. Imagine a people who had spent generations in captivity, now standing before a king whose bed was more than 4 meters long. Deuteronomy 3:11 tells us, "For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its width, after the cubit of a man." This verse gives us an idea of Og's impressive stature and how his fame spread, to the point that his bed was preserved as a relic. Og was not only large in stature, but also powerful. He ruled over 60 fortified cities, each protected by high walls, gates, and bars. Deuteronomy 3:5 says, "All these cities were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides a great many unwalled towns." Imagine the terror that must have gripped the Israelites when faced with such an adversary. How could they, a people with no military experience, hope to defeat a giant who commanded such a vast and fortified kingdom? The first powerful lesson we can draw is that the size of our challenge doesn't matter when God is on our side. The Lord said to Moses in Numbers 21:34, "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand, along with his whole army and his land." This promise must have sounded almost unbelievable to the Israelites, but God was about to demonstrate that his word is always fulfilled. However, the story of Og goes beyond his defeat. The victory over this giant paved the way for the conquest of the Promised Land and served as a lasting testimony to God's faithfulness. The Israelites could look back and remember that, even in the face of formidable enemies, God's protection was certain. Og's bed, preserved in Rabbah, served as a physical reminder of the greatness of the challenge they faced and overcame. This memory was not just a matter of national pride, but a source of continuous hope. Each generation of Israelites could learn that with God, no obstacle is insurmountable. Og's defeat instilled fear in the hearts of the other peoples the Israelites would face, showing that their God was greater than any giant or fortified city. Thus, the story of Og, the first giant of Bashan, teaches us that regardless of the size of the challenges we face, faith and trust in God enable us to overcome them. Before the battle against Og, the Israelites had already faced and defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, with a similar promise from God. This previous experience should have strengthened their faith, but facing a giant like Og was still a formidable test. The repetition of God's promise at this critical moment reminds us that he is patient with our doubts and fears, always ready to reassure us of his presence and faithfulness. The ensuing battle was spectacular and full of spiritual significance. Despite Og's immense strength and powerful defenses, the Israelites, led by Moses and strengthened by God's unwavering promise, achieved a resounding victory. Deuteronomy 3:7 describes the outcome of this battle in impressive detail. "So the Lord our God also delivered into our hands Og, king of Bashan, with all his people, and we attacked him until he had no survivors left. At that time we took all his cities. There was not a city we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan." This complete victory, where no enemy survived, demonstrated the totality of God's promise and his ability to fulfill his words absolutely. Moreover, the conquest of all Og's cities, especially the impressive sum of 60 fortified cities, not only highlighted the military power of the Israelites, but more importantly, underscored God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. The memory of these victories and God's protection provided the people of Israel with a living testimony of God's power and constant presence in their battles. This triumph became a solid foundation of faith and trust, not only for the generation that directly experienced these events, but also for future generations who would hear about the greatness of these conquests and God's faithfulness in times of conflict and challenge. This detailed description not only serves as a historical record, but also as a powerful testimony of the complete victory that God granted his people. The mention of the 60 fortified cities highlights the magnitude of the triumph, illustrating that no human defense can withstand God's power when he acts on behalf of his followers. Each captured city represented a testimony to God's supremacy, emphasizing that earthly forces are insignificant before God's will. The victory over Og was not merely a military triumph, it was a living testimony of God's power and his faithfulness to his promises. Imagine the impact on the faith and courage of the Israelites witnessing such an event. The conquest of Bashan became a landmark in Israel's history, often remembered in the Psalms and other biblical passages as an example of God's liberating power. Psalm 135, 10, 12 declares, "He struck down many nations and killed mighty kings. Sihon, king of the Amorites, Og, king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan. And he gave their land as an inheritance to his people Israel." This victory was more than just a battle won. It was an event that solidified the Israelites' faith in God's protection and promise. This memory served as a beacon of hope and confidence for future generations, reminding them that with God, no obstacle is insurmountable. The victory over Og paved the way for the conquest of the Promised Land and sowed fear in the hearts of other peoples the Israelites would face. The reputation of the Israelites as a people protected by a powerful God spread quickly, creating an aura of invincibility around them. We see evidence of this in Joshua 2:10, where Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, says to the Israelite spies, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed." This victory was a lasting testimony to God's power and a sign to all of Israel's enemies that the battle against God's people was not merely a fight against men, but a battle against God himself. The memory of this victory inspired courage in the hearts of the Israelites and reinforced their confidence in God, assuring them that he would always be by their side, leading and protecting them against any adversity. But the story of challenges and giants does not end here. Centuries after the victory over Og, the Israelites found themselves facing another giant, perhaps even more intimidating. His name was Goliath, a colossal warrior who stood as the champion of the Philistines, Israel's arch-enemies during the reign of King Saul. The setting of this new battle was quite different. Instead of the arid desert and fortified cities of Bashan, the confrontation took place in the valley of Elah, a fertile and green area in the mountainous region of Judah. The political and military context had also dramatically transformed. The Israelites were no longer a nomadic people recently freed from Egypt, but an established nation with their own kingdom and monarch. However, despite all these changes, the central challenge remained the same: trusting in God in the face of an apparently invincible enemy. Goliath was a terrifying sight, a true colossus. The Bible gives us a detailed description of his appearance and armor in 1 Samuel 17, 4-7. "And there went out a champion from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him." Goliath was the epitome of physical strength and military superiority. His height was impressive, being described as about 3 meters tall. He wore a bronze armor that weighed approximately 57 kilograms, protecting his body with layers of metal that shone under the sun. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves for additional protection, and carried a bronze javelin between his shoulders, ready to be launched with deadly precision. Goliath's spear was particularly impressive, with a shaft comparable to a weaver's beam and an iron point weighing about 7 kilograms. In front of him marched a shield-bearer, carrying a large shield that further covered and protected the giant. The sight of Goliath challenging the Israelites in the valley of Elah was terrifying. He not only represented a physical threat, but also a psychological challenge, mocking and insulting the Israelites and their God day after day for 40 days. His size and armor made him a formidable adversary, and many Israelite soldiers trembled in fear before him. However, this scene was not just about Goliath's brute strength, but about the struggle between faith in God and the paralyzing fear before a colossal enemy. Goliath's story became one of the most emblematic narratives of the Bible, representing the eternal battle between good and evil, faith and fear, and God's supremacy over any earthly force. Through this confrontation, the message that God does not look at the outward appearance, but at the heart and faith was powerfully and clearly demonstrated, setting the stage for the arrival of David, a young shepherd who fully trusted in God and would forever change the course of Israelite history. Let's pause for a moment to consider these impressive measurements. 6 cubits and a span equal approximately 2.90 meters. The coat of mail he wore weighed about 57 kilograms, more than many adult people. His spear was described as a weaver's beam, with an iron point weighing about 7 kilograms. Goliath was not just a giant, he was a true walking fortress, a terrifying sight for any adversary. For 40 days, Goliath incessantly challenged the armies of Israel, mocking them and their God. The account in 1 Samuel 17:8-10 captures his words of scorn. "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." These daily provocations were not only a challenge to the physical strength of the Israelites, but also a psychological attack intended to undermine their morale and faith. Imagine the devastating effect this had on the morale of the troops. Each morning and evening for over a month, the soldiers were reminded of their apparent inferiority before this Philistine colossus. Fear spread like a plague through the camp, corroding the warriors' confidence and leaving them paralyzed before the threat. The situation was so dire that 1 Samuel 17:11 reveals, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." The fear and despair were palpable, and Goliath's presence became a constant nightmare for the Israelites. Goliath's presence and daily challenges created an atmosphere of discouragement and terror among the Israelite soldiers. Each passing day without a champion to face the giant only reinforced the sense of helplessness and despair. Fear was not just a momentary emotion, but a persistent state that eroded the soldiers' courage and determination. King Saul, who should have been the leader and source of inspiration, was also deeply shaken, unable to find a solution to the threat posed by Goliath. This situation exposed not only the difference in physical strength between Goliath and the Israelites, but also the difference in confidence and faith. While Goliath relied on his strength and armor, the Israelites were losing confidence in their own ability to face the enemy. Fear and doubt began to cloud the people's vision, causing them to forget the many times God had intervened in their history, ensuring victories against seemingly invincible enemies. This period of persistent provocation and fear was a test of faith for the Israelites. They needed to remember that regardless of the physical threat before them, the true battle would be won, not by human strength, but by trust in God's power and promise. Goliath's presence, though intimidating, set the stage for a monumental demonstration that with God on their side, no earthly force, no matter how terrifying, could prevail. It is in this scenario of despair and fear that an unlikely hero enters the scene: David, a young shepherd. David's introduction into the narrative is seemingly casual and unassuming. He was not on the battlefield but at home, tending to his father Jesse's sheep. It was only when his father sent him to bring supplies to his brothers in the army that David encountered the tense and fearful situation dominating the Israelite camp. In 1 Samuel 17:20-22, we read, "So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers." This initial scene emphasizes the stark contrast between David and the experienced soldiers. While they were preparing for battle with war cries and armor, David arrived as a simple messenger, unaware of the terror gripping the camp. When all the experienced warriors trembled in fear before Goliath, this young shepherd, driven by an unshakable faith in God, boldly offered to face the Philistine giant. David's initial reaction to Goliath's challenge is recorded in 1 Samuel 17:26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Notice how David's perspective is radically different from that of the soldiers. Where they saw an invincible giant, David saw merely an uncircumcised Philistine who dared to defy the living God. This difference in perspective is crucial to understanding David's courage. His confidence was not in his own strength or ability, but in God's faithfulness and power. When David offered to fight Goliath, his offer was initially met with skepticism and even ridicule. His own eldest brother, Eliab, accused him of arrogance and irresponsibility. In 1 Samuel 17:28 we read, "Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, 'Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle.'" This accusation underscores Eliab's limited view of David, seeing him only as a curious and presumptuous young boy, without understanding the depth of his faith and courage. King Saul, upon hearing of David's offer, initially hesitated, but eventually agreed to let him fight. However, Saul tried to dress David in his own armor, a gesture that, though well-intentioned, demonstrated a lack of understanding of David's true source of strength. David's refusal to wear Saul's armor, recorded in 1 Samuel 17:39, was not just a matter of physical comfort, but a declaration of faith. He was trusting not in human protection, but in divine protection. David's words to Saul in 1 Samuel 17:37 summarize his confidence. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." David did not allow others' disbelief and skepticism to deter him from his mission. Armed only with his sling and 5 smooth stones from the brook, he approached the battlefield, not with the arrogance of a reckless youth, but with the confidence of someone who knew the battle belonged to the Lord. David faced Goliath with the certainty that God was by his side, and this unshakable faith was the key to his victory. This story, beyond being a tale of courage and faith, illustrates the eternal truth that true strength comes from trusting in God, not in human abilities or weapons. David, the unlikely hero, showed the world that faith in God can transform the simplest of shepherds into the greatest of warriors. David entered the battlefield armed only with his staff, 5 smooth stones, and his sling. This young shepherd did not possess a shining armor nor a sharp sword. He carried simple tools common to his life as a shepherd, but which would become instruments of a historic victory. Goliath, seeing David approach, felt insulted and enraged. 1 Samuel 17:43-44 describes Goliath's reaction. "And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field." Goliath was confident in his physical and military superiority, certain that no adversary, especially one as young and seemingly defenseless as David, could defeat him. Goliath, a giant with heavy armor and a gigantic spear, saw David as an insignificant opponent, a mere nuisance. He was accustomed to intimidating and defeating his enemies with ease. However, Goliath underestimated David's secret weapon, his unshakable faith in God. David was not intimidated by the giant's threats. Instead, he was secure in his trust in the Lord. David's response to Goliath is one of the most powerful and inspiring declarations of faith in the Bible. 1 Samuel 17:45-47 records his words full of conviction. "Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. These words reveal not only David's courage, but also his deep understanding that the true battle was not fought on the physical field, but on the spiritual one. For David, it was not his skill with the sling or the precision of his shot that mattered, but the certainty that God was fighting alongside him. He recognized that victory would come by God's hand, not by his own strength. Hearing David's declaration, Goliath advanced confidently, certain that he would crush the young Israelite. But David, firm in his faith, took a stone from his pouch, placed it in his sling, and with a quick and accurate movement, launched it directly at Goliath's forehead. The stone sank into the giant's forehead, and Goliath fell with a crash to the ground, dead. David then ran up to him, took Goliath's sword, and cut off his head, fulfilling exactly what he had said. David's victory over Goliath was not just a military triumph, it was a moment of affirmation of faith and God's power. This battle showed all Israel and the Philistines that true strength does not reside in weapons or size, but in trust in God. David's unshakable faith transformed a young shepherd into a national hero and an eternal symbol of courage and devotion. This story continues to inspire people of all generations to trust in God in the face of their own giants and challenges, reminding us that with God all things are possible. With these words of faith and confidence, David boldly advanced against Goliath. Without hesitation, he launched a stone with his sling, and the stone struck the giant square in the forehead, sinking into his skin and causing him to fall to the ground with a crash. David, seeing his fallen enemy, quickly ran up to him. Without delay, he took Goliath's heavy sword and with a decisive blow cut off his head, completing a victory that seemed impossible to human eyes. This unexpected and miraculous victory is an eternal testimony of God's power and the unshakable faith of a young shepherd. Goliath's fall was not just a physical defeat for the Philistines, but a spiritual and psychological defeat that demonstrated to all present, both Israelites and Philistines, that true power does not reside in physical strength or armor, but in trust in God. David's courage, driven by his faith, served as a powerful example of how confidence in the Lord can transform seemingly hopeless situations into glorious triumphs. Just as God used David to defeat Goliath, he can also enable us to overcome the giants in our lives. No matter how large or intimidating our challenges may seem, with faith and trust in God, we can overcome any obstacle. David's story reminds us that even when facing adversities that seem insurmountable, faith in God can give us the strength to prevail. David, a simple shepherd, showed that true strength comes from the Lord, and that with him by our side, we can face and defeat any giant. May the stories of Og and Goliath inspire us to trust in God's power and believe that with him, we are capable of achieving the impossible. The victories over these giants are not just accounts of ancient heroic deeds, but eternal lessons about the importance of faith, courage, and trust in the Lord. They remind us that regardless of the circumstances, God is always present to guide and strengthen us. When we place our trust in God, he enables us to face our greatest fears and triumph over them. Therefore, as we face our own giants in life, may we remember David's faith and trust that with God, nothing is impossible.